Hi, I took a first edition Dungeons & Dragons adventure and converted it to 5th edition. This video is about the lessons learned from doing the conversion. Back in 1980, 1981, I wrote up an adventure called Key to Druid's Gate. It was a simple little adventure. It was using the Fiend Folio, which had just come out, and I was using a bunch of monsters from the Fiend Folio. Honestly, the Fiend Folio has some rather iffy monsters, but it was. I picked out a handful and we went through with that. And I had an artist working with me named Chuck Hards. I actually drew up some of the stuff and we actually created and published. That was before TSR started getting really nasty about people publishing other things. It was long before D20 and some of the open ideas. But we sold a few copies, not many, but of the Key to Druid's Gate. So with 5th edition, I kept hearing all this wonderful things about how it was back more like the old school rules, back much more like 1st edition. So I decided to try taking my old adventure and updating it to the new system. This was a lot more work than I expected. And what do I mean by that? Well, first off, way back when I had actually computer generated the maps, but they were really kind of awful by today's standards. So I ended up redrawing all the maps, which was one of the problems. The maps way back then were one of the standards from Judges Guild was that each hex was 5 miles across, but I forgot that. So I'm seeing these hexes and I don't know how big it is. And so the scale of the map when I redo it was an interesting challenge. So I started the adventure. The characters created the players created their characters, and we started off. When I ran Key to Druid's Gate, I ran it as a semi-tournament dungeon, which meant in 4 hours the party completed the adventure. That was from character generation to completion of the adventure. And the way I tended to run tournament dungeons was that you would start with a clean sheet of paper or an empty character sheet. You would create it when the party says that they were ready to start, then would start. So they could take as long as they wanted on character creation. Generally, they spent about an hour and then 3 hours running through the adventure. When I ran it through Google Hangouts, now some people say Google Hangouts slow things down. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It was 10.5 hours over 4 adventures. We broke up. Now, the advantage of sitting around a table is that the party normally doesn't change, whereas we had some turnover of players and characters and various things like that. And going through scaling the monsters was an interesting challenge because there's some calculators out there which will take the armor class and the hit points and give you some ideas about it. But creating something that the players could either fight or have a chance against, or that the monsters would have a chance against, was actually the interesting thing. Because when I created the adventure, it was for 6th level. In theory, it was for 10 6th level characters. Well, we never did have 10, so that was one of the challenges. But a lot of the monsters that I pulled out from the Fiend Folio turned out to be extremely wimpy, and the party would kill them off really quickly, which was sort of surprising to me. And then when they'd run into other monsters, they would be excruciatingly difficult for them to take on. For example, I'm reading through the adventure, and there's party supposed to take on 2 mottled worms. A mottled worm is an underwater version of a purple worm. And when I game, I often, if I suddenly realize that it's going to be kind of nasty for the party, that may end up just obliterating the party from the characters, I'll pull punches, as the saying goes. So what happened was, though a mottled worm actually has 2 attacks, I was only using one of them. It wasn't stinging, it was just trying to bite it, though it did kill one of the members of the party. But that was interesting. They were there. One of the members of the party decided to try and finish the adventure and so on. But anyway, it was an interesting, there were interesting party dynamics. There were interesting things going through there. The challenge, another challenge was saving throws. Back in first edition, you didn't have as many different kinds of saving throws. Your saving throws were you had death, you had magic. There were only a handful going back to original D&D, which is where I started. But in 5th edition, you have one for each of your attributes in theory, plus sort of on others, which gets a little fuzzy. And trying to figure out how to convert them, and the 5th edition is a little vague in a certain set of scenarios. Like, for example, paladins in theory are immune to charm, but does that mean that they're immune to hypnotic plants? We were using one of the creatures was a yellow musk creeper, which can hypnotize and release a spray of musk that will cause the character to wander into the plant, and it basically turns you into a yellow musk zombie. But does that affect paladins? So what happens is there were some issues there. One of the bigger challenges was underwater combat. And I actually marked this. I pulled out my old battered up copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I thought I'd read a couple of phrases from the first edition. It says, underwater combat is difficult for normal landborne creatures. Coming down here, it says, underwater player characters attempt to do so. So what happens is it says, especially for certain specially made crossbows, use of missile weapons is generally impossible underwater. So crossbows, and it says that you can only use, where is this? Single-handed. Net is difficulty. Underwater net. Okay. Here it is. Due to the water resistance, effective use of crushing weapons or cleaving weapons will not be possible. Only thrusting weapons will be of any use. This means spears, tridents, daggers, stabbing swords, etc. So that's first edition. Now, if I pull up 5th edition, and this was an interesting change. In the underwater combat in first edition is documented in the DMG, Dungeon Master's Guide. In 5th edition, it's documented in the Player's Handbook, not in the DMG. So moving it from one book to another. And underwater combat, mind you, in the first edition, you have a full column. In 5th edition, you have less than a third of a column. And it says, when making a melee, a creature that doesn't have a swimming speed, either natural, has disadvantage on the attack roll unless the weapon is a dagger, javelin, short sword, spear, or trident. It's missing one of the key lines, which was in the first edition, that it's a stabbing type weapon, which doesn't explain, and it's not explained here. Ranged weapon attack automatically misses a target beyond the weapon's normal range, but it doesn't put the clarification that you have to have a special kind of crossbow to do that. So there's that. So I thought I'd pull up 4th edition and look at what 4th edition said about underwater combat. And 4th edition has a full column. Well, I guess it's half a column. It's nowhere near as detailed as in first edition, but it's more than what's in 5th. And see, underwater fighting underwater is tricky business for land-dwelling creatures. Adventures. Anyway, the way it works in Characters using weapons from the spear and crossbow weapon group take no penalties to attack rolls with those weapons while fighting underwater. Characters using any other weapons take a -2 penalty to attack rolls. So this is one of the interesting features, and I think I'm going to do another video on this. And this is the advantage versus disadvantage. If you take a look at the way the probabilities happen for with advantage versus disadvantage, in first edition, I think it's a -4 or -2, and in fourth edition it's a minus. In fifth edition, they went to this disadvantage roll, which changes the dynamics significantly about how combat works. It's not just a minus off of your attack roll. So this makes it it makes the combat very different, makes it much harder to figure out the scaling of what's happening with when you're trying to fight this. So the interesting thing that I came about is that though the claim that first edition, the fifth edition was as fast as first edition is false, in my opinion. It's nowhere near as fast as going back to OD&D or for AD&D as it was called at the time. It's faster than fourth, and I prefer it to fourth after using it, but it's nowhere near as fast as some of the very early editions. Still much more complicated. Fighters have more capabilities. Basically, they have the spells. Healing was an interesting challenge with the party because for some parts of the adventure they didn't have any clerics, which is always been a problem with that. You didn't have, they didn't pick up any potions of healing and so on, which was much more common back in first edition. The other thing that I feel in a long-running campaign, and this is one of the house rules that I am going to introduce into all my 5th edition campaigns, is I firmly feel that it should be like the first edition and OD&D, where you get experience for gold and for magical items. The reason I feel that way is what happens when a character goes into town and he sees somebody walking by and pickpockets him. In 5th edition, there's nothing got killed. There was no quest. He just happened to see a character, see an opportunity, and took it. So he gets no experience points for that in 5th edition. Unless you do whole machinations about, oh, it's a on-the-spot spurred quest, which is foolish. To me, the whole concept that you have to have quests to get to get experience points, goes against some of the original ideas. You could get quests, you could be Geost, various things back in first edition, but that was fairly rare, at least the way I was running it. So I like to have a truly open world where characters can go anywhere, can do anything. They're not driven by quests. They may be driven by quests. They may have some desire to achieve something, to do something. Like in my World of Tiglath campaign, they want to overthrow the Marzar. In my World of Amoras, they want to get rid of the Lich Kegel. But those are not forced on the characters, except maybe in the first adventure. I tend to railroad characters, as the saying goes, in the first couple of adventures to get them into the campaign, but then they can do anything they want. With a few exceptions, once in a while, I think it's appropriate to railroad someone. But those are things that you don't see in 5th edition. From a typesetting point of view, I really dislike the 5th edition. For me, in my office, when I'm gaming here, the lighting is not great. It's fine for the video, I think, but it isn't conducive to the pages in the 5th edition. They're very, very, the footer is very, it's a light gray on a gray paper, and it's hard to read. And for me, I can't see the page numbers, and I have to pull the book up next to me to see the page numbers. So you find something in the index, you go to look it up in the book, and it's hard to find the page numbers. They don't have continued heads. They, instead of putting heads for what the chapters were at the top of the page, they put them at the bottom page, which I didn't even notice until tonight. So the typesetting, it makes it difficult to use the index. So 5th edition, I think, is a step up from 4th edition in being a much more customized. It's no longer so grid-based, which was truly painful in my opinion, but it still has some issues, some house rules like experience and allowing them to sell magical items much more easily and so on. It can be, I think it can be worthwhile. It has the advantage to 5th edition for me is that you'll be able to find more players willing to play 5th edition than you will be finding players playing OD&D or 1st edition. The 5th edition also, grappling, another challenge that was in there is what they call conditions, and it didn't describe grappling very well, and it leaves a lot of things ambiguous. So they shortened up a bunch of the text. They took out some explanatory comments, which were in 1st edition. And all in all, it's mediocre. It's not bad. It's just not very good in the typesetting, in some of the notations, and so on. But I'm going to be running two campaigns with 5th edition, the World of Tiglath and the World of Amoras. And if you're interested, join us. I run one on Friday night at 11:30, and I run the other one on Saturday at 8 p.m. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Put some comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up, and I'll make some more of these.